This is the third part of today's lecture in which we talked about motion studies. In the first part, we talked about the relationship between painting and photography. And we said that one of the ways in which photography tried to separate itself from painting was to capture or to freeze motion in a photograph. In the second part, I introduced you to a couple of photographers, artists, scientists who were playing with motion studies and who tried to find a way for that motion to be frozen and captured in a photograph. Now, in the last part, I wanted to see how that shutter, how that freezing of the motion changed photography. First of all, let's talk about democratization of photography. Until late 1870, photography was primarily an exclusive medium, limited only to practitioners with excessive scientific knowledge and a lot of time on their hands. Now, if you think about it, the processes that we had daguerreotype and calotype at the beginning, and then after 1851, we had wet plate collodion. Now, all of the three processes required photographers to prepare the plates, to know how to properly expose them, and then to develop them. So they really required a lot of scientific knowledge. At that time, until late 1870s, there were a lot of photographs in the world, but not that many photographers. There were two inventions that helped convert photography into an inclusive medium. One was dry glass plate, and the other one was flexible film. Now, dry glass plate was invented by Dr. Richard L. Maddox in 1871. In 1879, George Eastman opened the Eastman Film and Dry Plate Company. What was so revolutionary about dry plate was that photographers no longer had to coat their own plates and expose them before they dry out. If you remember the wet plate collodion process, photographers were required to first clean the plate, then pour collodion over, wait until it's sticky a little bit, then dip it into the solution of silver salt, put it into a camera, expose it, then develop it before it dries out. Now with a dry plate, everything before exposure, all of the process before exposure was eliminated. What photographers can do now is go to a store, ask for 20 dry plates, take images, and then have them developed. So people who didn't have this excessive scientific knowledge were able to do photography. The other invention was flexible film. The first flexible photographic roll film was sold again by George Eastman in 1885. This original film was actually a coating on a paper base. As part of the processing, the image-bearing layer was stripped from the paper and attached to a sheet of hardened clear gelatin. The first transparent plastic film followed in 1889. However, it was made from a highly flammable nitrocellulose, now usually called nitrate film. Cellulose acetate or safety film has been introduced by Kodak in 1908. So now photographers with this flexible film no longer had to rely on a fragile glass plate. Flexible film, first paper than plastic, made it much more convenient for photographers. It was not as fragile, but it was not as heavy. Now also we have a Kodak camera. On September 4th, 1888, George Eastman received a patent for the original camera shutter and trademark for the company's name Kodak. Now, Kodak camera was the first handheld camera with flexible film released in 1888, which helped bring photography to the masses. Because now no longer we have to have this heavy camera on a tripod. We can actually take the camera with our hands, walk into the world, and take images. Kodak camera was a simple camera with a crank to advance film and a single shutter speed. It didn't have a focusing ring. So it was very hard to do any kind of variation with that camera. It would only focus up to that far, and it only had one shutter speed. It had a roll of film that could take 100 images. After exposing the film, photographer would ship the entire camera to a lab in Rochester, where Kodak factory was. The lab would develop film, make prints, load another roll of film into the camera, and ship it back with the bill. And this is one of the advertising for that camera, which says, you press the shutter, we do the rest. And this idea of we do the rest was part that set Kodak apart. It is really the beginning of snapshot photography, which allowed people to document their lives. And again, before Kodak camera in 1888, people had to rely on heavy cameras on tripods in order to take the images. There was a limited number of people who were able to do that. And also before dry plate and flexible film, the only way for people to make photograph was to use either the daguerreotype or calotype in the early ages or after 1851 wet plate collodion, which required a huge scientific knowledge. And these are some of the early images done with Kodak camera. And you can see that their shape was a circular shape, which is the original shape of a photograph. Because if you think about it, the opening of the lens is a circular opening. When light goes through it, the image recorded in the back is a circular shape. Now we go back to the influence that painting had on photography. The circular shape didn't really go well with the masses because the shape was so unusual. People are used to looking at images in rectangular shape. So after this trial and having the first Kodak camera recording circular shaped images, Kodak changed the design and made the final shape of an image be a rectangular shape. And it is fascinating. For the first time, we are actually seeing these images of an everyday recorded by a handheld Kodak camera. So anybody can take photographs now. It is no longer available only to a small set of professionals. Dry plate, flexible film, and Kodak camera gave birth to amateur photography. I just want to explain to you what amateur meant at that time. The meaning is not the same as it is today. So amateur comes from a Latin word amator, which means lover, and it refers to photographers who practice photography just for the love of it. They had no commercial aspiration. Now, one thing, if we think about amateur today, everybody would think that amateur work is the work that doesn't really have a high quality. However, in original meaning of the word amateur has nothing to do with the quality of work. It is just whether the work was done for the love of it or it was done for a commercial purpose. And these are some of the amateur photographs of that time. And we can see now the world in the photographs that we had never seen before. We can see just a guy holding his son, or we can see a shepherd looking at his sheep. We can see people looking at the sea in front of the ship. This is one of the amateur albums that people will now record everyday life and then putting them in the albums just like we are doing it today. That kind of albums have never been seen before. They were only able to have them with the invention of flexible film, dry plate, and Kodak camera, which allowed for this amateur photography to really develop. So by the late 1880s, photography changes in a number of ways. Speed of photographic material increased and shutter mechanism was introduced. So photography is no longer practiced only by a small number of professionals. It is now affordable, easy to use, and it finally belongs to everybody. And I wanted to compare just a daguerreotype from 1840s and then one of the snapshots from 1880s. And we can see the stiffness in the early photography caused by a very slow shutter speed. And we can see the spontaneity of a snapshot photography 4 decades later because of the increased shutter speed and again, introduction of flexible film, dry plate, and Kodak camera. And finally, in 1889, Edison saw Marey's camera. He patented perforated film to be used in kinetoscope. And kinetoscope is a box containing 35 millimeter positive film, several feet long, to be viewed by one person at a time, something like a peep show. It was patented in 1893. In 1894, kinetoscope became available to everyone. And in 1895, Lumiere brothers perfected it and named it cinematograph. So that was beginning of today's cinema and moving images. In March 22, 1895, first projection of a 1 minute long motion picture happened. So we went from still photography in 1839 to a motion picture in 1895. Thank you for listening to today's lecture, and please make sure to follow further instructions on Blackboard.